Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Pritchard. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Prevention and Health Promotion Director at the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. If you are not familiar with the Action Alliance, we have this lovely slide that kind of covers our many variety of projects. When you get the slides, all of the images are linked, so you can click and go directly to any of the websites for these projects. The Action Alliance is Virginia's dual coalition for sexual and intimate partner violence, and we have three functions. The first being as a member organization. So as a member organization, the Action Alliance provides training, technical assistance, and resources to member organizations, so sexual and domestic violence agencies. But we also provide memberships to allied organizations, allied professionals, and individuals. We are also a policy organization. And so that means that we're advocating for survivor-centered policies at the local, state, and federal level. And then finally, we do have a direct service component to our organization. And we house the 24/7 statewide hotline, the PREA hotline, the Prison Rape Elimination Act hotline, and the LGBTQ warm line. So we do have that aspect where we're interfacing directly with survivors. So important for you all to know, this workshop is an abbreviated version of a full day training that we are calling our revamped Project Connect training. In 2013 or so, the Action Alliance was a partner with Futures Without Violence and several other states that were diving into encouraging sexual and domestic violence agencies to interface more directly with healthcare centers. And so we're trying to revamp that because Virginia was very involved in that process in the beginning. And as our engagement has changed, we've noticed that there are fewer agencies that are directly connecting with health centers in their communities. So we want to make sure that these connections are really clear for folks, and we want to start training and getting people to build these relationships. So if it feels like certain parts are just a little taste, that's because they are, especially toward the end of the workshop when we actually start talking about bridging the gap, because I think that there are a lot of pieces that are best served, when we come out to you to do this training in community, and when you're doing it with your local health department staff, for example. So this is what our time is going to look like together today, and I do have a little stretch break in the middle. I know I have a colleague who does not believe in stretch breaks. She says that 5-minute breaks aren't enough, but I personally think sometimes it's nice to just stop. I don't want to hear myself talk for a few minutes in the middle of one of these. And I think that taking a moment to step away from the screen, grab a glass of water is really important. Sitting for hours and hours at a computer at a time doesn't feel natural to me even still. So at the Action Alliance, when we facilitate any kind of training or workshop or online space, we typically try to bring a couple of community agreements. If we were doing ongoing sessions, we would build these together. But because this is kind of just a drop-in, one-time engagement on our end, these are the three that I would like to propose. So the first being what's learned here leaves here, what's said here stays here. When we get into topics related to sexual and reproductive coercion, that intersection of reproductive and sexual health with sexual and intimate partner violence, I've experienced many times that folks open up, they might share personal information or stories. And so if that is something that does happen, I think it's really important for folks to keep in mind, not sharing that out. I want you to share the lessons, but not necessarily the individual or personal stories. We also encourage folks to take care of yourself and take care of each other. We enter every space as though there are survivors in the room, and trauma is incredibly prevalent. So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and also be thoughtful in the ways that we're interacting together today, because you will go into small groups and have opportunities to connect with each other. And then the final agreement that I would like to propose for this space is just to be committed to each other's collective learning and growing. No one knows everything, but together we do know a lot. And we hope that folks will be generous and kind to each other, to make room for folks' feelings and perspectives, and understanding that we're all differently enmeshed in different systems of power. And we know that everyone can't be articulate all the time. So we embrace imperfect language in these spaces. We're all here to learn and to grow and to learn from each other. And so I really enjoy interacting with audiences. It's a little bit harder to do in these virtual spaces, but I have built in a component so that I can get a little bit better of a sense of what it is that brought you all here today. So I'm going to use Mentimeter, and I would love for you to go to menti.com and enter the code 2878 9344. And I can put that into the chat as well. And you are going to just let us know what brought you to this training today. So I'm going to share that screen so that we can see responses as they come in. And forgive me if I'm kind of looking all over. I have multiple monitors because I think that's the only way that you can kind of do this. Can everyone see the Menti? Wonderful. So as responses start coming in, we'll be able to see those. So better advocacy for survivors, wonderful. You're the sexual violence prevention coordinator and you're always looking for continued education opportunities. Really excited to have you here. Staying current on sexual violence research and best practices for prevention. Work with survivors, sexual violence survivors, and you're always looking to learn more. Interested in developing partnerships with reproductive healthcare providers? Absolutely. Wanted to have more information and knowledge on this topic as someone who is a counselor and has done prevention work at a local sexual assault agency. How to help perpetrators. I love seeing so many prevention staff here. It's funny, I'm the person on staff who often does the coercion trainings, but I do mostly prevention work full time. So I love seeing so many people who are thinking about this as an intersection and something to think about related to prevention. So always interested in learning more about this topic. That's ways to talk to survivors, always increasing knowledge, coordination of medical services with advocacy, a reproductive justice volunteer and work in sexual violence prevention, and you'd like to learn more about the intersection of this work. Yeah, we have so many sponges, people who love to learn. I really appreciate that. And this person works in the county within consuming children, youth, and families. And we get to definitely use more education on these sexual violence topics to better understand and serve our families. Absolutely. And the initial Project Connect partnership was a partnership not only between sexual and domestic violence agencies and reproductive healthcare providers, but there's also a home visiting component. So that is a really important intersection as well. So I hope that based on these, I think that there are lots of opportunities for us to expand knowledge, to think through coordination of services. And I think that that many of you will see what you're hoping to get out of this training in the training today. So that's really great news. I'm gonna change my share back to my presentation. We'll see if this is smooth. Thank you all for participating in that. And just to double check my people who I can see on the screen, we're back to the PowerPoint. Perfect. Whenever I was teaching a class in the spring, I always had one person that I'd have to keep an eye on. I need a thumbs up ever so often. And then I do see a chat. Oh, thank you. So to start this conversation, I think it's really important to ground in these three key points. The first being that sexual and intimate partner violence are incredibly common. More than 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. The second key point, which is particularly relevant to the conversation today, is that violence has serious impacts on long-term health and chronic health conditions. Asthma, arthritis, headaches and migraines, back pain, chronic pain syndromes, high cholesterol, stroke, and irritable bowel syndrome are just some of the comorbid health conditions experienced by survivors of intimate partner violence. And finally, abusive partners prevent survivors from accessing healthcare. And so this study is a little bit older than I would like to reference, but a lot of what is referenced throughout this is what Futures Without Violence uses in their data. And they've consistently stayed on top of best practices and bringing more things out. So I really trust them as a leader in this conversation to share this information. But in a 2000 study, they found that 17% of women who reported experiencing abuse by an intimate partner in the past year reported that their partner did not allow them access to healthcare or interfered with their healthcare, compared to just 2% of non-abused women, which is the language used in that study. And this number increases for women who are living with HIV, which is a particular intersection of vulnerability. And so I think that this sets us up for why we're really here and why this is such an important conversation, because as advocates, as healthcare providers, as anyone who interacts with physical and mental health of survivors, you have a really interesting opportunity to ensure that folks are accessing care and the support that they need. And so we're going to go into small groups really quickly, and we're going to have a conversation, because I think that it's always really helpful to get folks thinking about how have you seen this connect with your work before you start hearing kind of the theoretical things from me. And so I'm going to pop these questions into chat before you all go into, oh, maybe I will not pop them into chat. I will pop them into the breakout room announcement so that you'll be able to see them one more time before you go. But the two questions that you're going to be talking about are how may experiences of intimate partner violence or sexual violence impact a person's reproductive health and or their ability to manage their reproductive health. And the second question is, how have you seen this show up in your work? So how do you think it might impact a person? And then how have you actually seen this show up? And then if you could just ask one person in your group to jot down some notes. We're not going to do a formal report back. I think that those can be especially painful when we're in these larger groups. But I would love for folks to pop a couple things in the chat. And then if you have some really great conversations, I'd love for folks to come off of mute, and then you can share some of that. And since we'll be going into groups of about 4, I think 10 minutes is a good amount of time to do that. And then we'll call you back into the main meeting space and do some debrief. So any questions before you all go? And there won't be any recording in your small meeting rooms.
Okay, so I am gonna do the breakout rooms now. And Kristen, I'm just waiting for more people to, there's still some people in the main room. So once that is, I'll broadcast the message. I typed it up on a Word document.
Thank you. I thought that it would be easy to grab it out of my presenter notes and copy and paste, but the way that I have screen set up, it won't be. And I'd rather not mess with what's working.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, okay. I think this will be, so I'm going to broadcast a message to all the rooms.
Thank you.
Oh, it doesn't let me. It's too long. So I can send number 2 for sure. I'm just gonna have to shorten IPV and sexual violence.
That's totally fine.
Did you see what time they went? You let me know when you want to close it.
Yeah, so at 10:22, if we could give them a 5-minute warning,
At 10:22, 5-minute warning. Okay. We'll do that.
and then 10:27, we'll close it.
Okay.
I didn't get a good sense of all of the participants who are on. Did it look like there are a lot of folks from sexual and domestic? It looked like many folks were in sexual and domestic violence agencies, but there were a couple of people who mentioned medical connections in the Menti.
So I can't really tell by their name. I would have to look at their email address. But to be honest, there's a combination of people here. There's some from Fairfax County domestic and sexual violence, maybe like a handful. I know that there's college. And other people, there's a couple of volunteers that work for us and other DV and SV organizations, and other people in different agencies within Fairfax County, and there is some nonprofit. Yeah, it's just easier to tell by their email address instead of their name. I don't know everybody by name, unfortunately.
Depending on what report back looks like, I might actually not do a small group at the end with bridging the gap. I think we might be able to do that in large group because this is a lot smaller than initially anticipated.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is totally fine. That's a lot easier to manage, really.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Did you guys see the 5-minute warning, or only the people in the groups do?
I saw it also.
Okay.
I didn't join. I clicked like to not join, but I still see the little alerts that's coming in.
I wasn't sure if it's only for like, in the main room as well. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us. So everybody right now is in breakout rooms, but I'm not going to put you in one because we are ending the breakout rooms at 10:27. So you'll have less than a minute.
And I'm going to stop my share when they come back so that we can see each other and then put my screen back on.
Okay, so I'm closing all the rooms now.
Thank you. It's a good sign when it takes a minute for people to come back. It means that conversations were good.
We'll close in 10 seconds.
And Kristen, you said put in the chat the things that our group discussed.
And if you'd like to share out verbally, that's also an option. Welcome back, folks. I worry when everybody comes back at the last second that the breakout rooms close, that they should have been a minute or two longer, because hopefully that means that you all were really getting into your conversations. So I would love if folks could put a couple of key points that you talked about either in the chat. If you'd like to come off of mute, you can raise your hand, or you can, actually, I'm not sure if I can see that you've raised a hand because I'm not a host. So I think you can unmute. I'd love to hear what folks thought. How have you seen this show up? How do you think that this might interfere with a person's ability to manage their reproductive health? Sex viewed in some groups as a marital right.
So this is Connie from Northern Virginia Community College. First of all, I would say I didn't even realize this was going to be a national call. And so people in my breakup room were from everywhere else but Virginia. So it was kind of nice. But what we talked about a lot, or some, I should say, is the differences of opinion that partners have when they're living together about reproduction, and how it's quite easy for one person to express his or her or their opinion more strongly, and so influence the other one, and yet have a baby without necessarily wanting to, or having one person have the control of the birth control pills.
Mm-hmm.
You know, either you will take them every day or you will not take them at all. Maybe somebody else from our group has something else to say.
Connie, I feel like your group sounds like you tapped in on something that we'll talk about in a second, though, and that's really that there is a spectrum of behavior. You know, something that is as clear and outright as one person hanging onto the birth control and giving them to the person directly, versus kind of those conversations where people might not have the same ideas about what they want in terms of reproduction, and how that can lead to coercion. Can really, it feels like that spectrum. So I appreciate that you have kind of tapped into that already. And I see that DV causes a lot of stress on the body. Absolutely. We're learning more and more about the impacts of domestic violence on the body, the brain, more and more. Excuse me, my allergies are really bad. We discussed how, oh yeah.
My group, we talked a little bit about the health effects that some of the other groups were mentioning, and how that could influence, you know, reproductive health in the future, forced pregnancies, forced abortions, obviously, as well as emotional health. But then we also got into a pretty decent conversation about with forced pregnancies, with you know, like one after the other, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids type of pregnancies, how that can lead to a lot of isolation, and how even sometimes in some of the cases that we were talking about, it's almost like they don't even realize it. They love their kids. They don't think anything's wrong with their lifestyle, no matter how isolating it may be. So we got the conversation about how do we extend those resources to these families who may not even want the help or realize that they need the help.
Absolutely. And I think that that's another really important consideration, that there are red flags that we might identify. Something like rapid repeat pregnancies can be something that might be a red flag, but depending on a person's cultural or religious beliefs, that might be something that feels very okay. And so that's where screening and talking to people and getting a better sense of what's going on for them is so important. And determining is there power and control here. Michelle, I see your hand.
Yeah, consistent with that, some in our group had seen, you know, forced pregnancy or forced use of birth control and some of these dynamics, but others had not really seen it. And one is a provider from group that specializes in serving South Asian women, and she said that there are cultural barriers to even having this discussion, and would like guidance maybe on how to start that conversation.
Absolutely. And that's something that we will absolutely be talking about when we come back from the stretch break, because I think that, so at the Action Alliance, my title used to be the Sexual and Reproductive Health Promotion Manager. And I was kind of always beating the drum of, we need to talk to folks about sex and sexuality. And in my experience doing this work, it's amazing how many advocates I interact with who are really comfortable talking about horrific experiences of violence and can navigate those conversations with kindness and empathy. But when we start talking about sex and sexuality or healthy sexuality, it can be really tough. And I think that what that says to me is just culturally, we have a lot of difficult, there's a lot of stigma related to sex and sexuality. It's both we're bombarded by it, and also we're not supposed to talk about it at the same time. And it sends a lot of really confusing messages. And that also really varies depending on the intersection of identities. I've also been really transparent that as a cis white woman, it's a lot easier for me to kind of bring up healthy sexuality in a lot of contexts, because I'm not stigmatized in the way that women of color might be, or fetishized in the way that women of color might be, to have these conversations really openly and consistently. I see that Abby also put in the chat, we discussed how conversations around reproductive health, like STIs, pregnancy, et cetera, can be high conflict and difficult conversations for any couple. So they can be particularly fraught for couples where a partner is using violence. And I think that that's such an incredible point to bring up, that it can be really tough to have these conversations, especially to Connie's point around when there are differences and perspectives in a relationship about what feels comfy for one person and what doesn't feel comfy, and that's in a healthy relationship. So having the skills to navigate those conversations, to me, that feels like that intersection of prevention, or that place where universal education is so important, because we want folks to have the skills to have these conversations with their partner, that's really important. Did anything else come up for folks? Let's go in the chat really quickly.
Yeah, I can share. We did talk about, for people who do get out of these types of relationships, having been impacted by forced or multiple pregnancies, maybe no longer having the ability to reproduce, being very removed from their own concept of their sexuality, how this can negatively impact their quote unquote candidacy as a good partner moving forward in their future relationships. And having the difficulty of navigating that, and now this abusive relationship and the implications of it are being further dragged as they go, even if that relationship is severed.
Yeah, I think that if you're working with survivors, you see how difficult it can be to navigate feelings of stigma or shame related to being in an abusive relationship. And when things related to sexual and reproductive health, if a partner has intentionally exposed someone to an STI, that then they must disclose in future relationships, that there are just these added layers that can come up. It can make it really complicated for folks, or it can feel really complicated for folks. I think that there are lots of ways to have those discussions in healthy ways and transparent ways with future partners, but it does mean that there need to be skill building and conversations with survivors about those things moving forward. So I think that you all have landed on several different pieces related to sexual and reproductive coercion. So I'm going to move back to the slideshow. And so first, we're going to talk a little bit about sexual coercion, but at the Action Alliance, when we're talking about these, we lump them together. And so when I'm thinking about them together, sexual and reproductive coercion involve this range of behaviors that are related to maintaining power and control over another person, that use tactics to impact another person's sexual and reproductive health and well-being. And so specifically when I'm thinking about sexual coercion, these are behaviors that involve creating a feeling, a situation, or an atmosphere where emotional control, manipulation, guilt, shame, or pressure can lead a person to feeling that they have no choice but to submit to sexual activity. And so some of the examples that a person might engage in sexual coercion, I think of if you loved me, you would. We've done it before, so you can't say no now. Threats to end a relationship if a partner doesn't want to engage in certain sexual activities. Pressure to not use condoms during sex. So the sex itself is consensual, but pressure to not use the form of contraception or that their partner wants to. Threatening retaliation if notified of a positive STI result, disregarding safe words during sex, using insults or guilt trips to manipulate a partner into engaging in sexual activity. And you're not really queer if you won't do this with me, making you feel like you owe them, badgering a person, wearing a person down, threatening to get sex somewhere else. And so I've included the Fry's model of consent from Planned Parenthood that I really like, because I think that it really helps to exemplify the many ways that sexual coercion, that these behaviors violate various aspects of consent. So sexual coercion, it's interesting. I feel like when I have facilitated conversations about this in the past, it's most often we end up focusing on reproductive coercion. And I think that part of that happens because it's easier to identify those behaviors sometimes, like birth control sabotage or forced pregnancy or pregnancy pressure. Whereas sexual coercion, I personally, since I've been doing this work, I see examples of this in media all of the time. And I feel like I always give the example of kind of the 90s, early 2000s sitcom where the husband is kind of poking at his wife for being a prude or not wanting to have sex and things like that. And so I think that some of these behaviors are really normalized, like wearing a person down until they just give in to sexual behavior. So it's interesting. I find that the conversation tends to gear toward reproductive coercion, but I think sexual coercion is so important because when we're thinking about true bodily autonomy, a person feeling completely empowered to do what they want to do with their body and not be pressured into anything is so important. And sexual coercion completely violates that. And I think that this is where my intersection with prevention education becomes so important. In a healthy relationship, giving and receiving consent is an ongoing process. And so we want folks to have the skills and to be able to identify that this is a constant process. Do you want to do this tonight? Are we going to go here? It's not just checking in once and assuming that that is okay forever. So when we get into reproductive coercion, this is where we're thinking about behaviors that interfere with contraception use and pregnancy. And so this might include birth control sabotage, which a few of you mentioned came up in your discussions. And so that's interfering with a person's selected method of contraception. Pregnancy pressure, so pressuring a person to become pregnant when they don't want to become pregnant. And then pregnancy coercion is defined as threats or acts of violence if a partner doesn't comply with wishes regarding the decision to terminate or continue a pregnancy. So an abusive partner might encourage a person to keep a pregnancy that they do not want to keep or terminate a pregnancy that they did want to keep. And so examples of birth control sabotage can include things like destroying birth control pills. If you all remember a couple of years ago, Pete Davidson on Saturday Night Live, when he was dating Ariana Grande, made the joke about switching out her birth control pills with mints or something like that, which is just like poking at this notion that if she gets pregnant, then she's stuck with me. And I'm just like, this is not a joke. It's not funny. This is abuse whenever we can't normalize behaviors like that. Another kind of pop culture moment that put a lot of spotlight on acts of reproductive coercion was a few years ago. There was a lot of online attention to what some men were calling selfing, which was they were engaging in consensual sex with their partner with condoms, but then removing the condoms without their partner's knowledge or consent. And so stealthing became something that folks were paying a lot of attention to a few years ago. And so it sparked some bigger conversations around birth control sabotage and reproductive coercion nationally. And I see Britney Spears' current case as an example of birth control sabotage. And I think that from my limited understanding, it sounds like she has been forced to have an IUD to prevent pregnancy. And I think that that's a really good example of reproductive coercion that's happening from a family. And Lauren says, even families can engage in pregnancy pressure for a married couple, asking, when are you going to have kids? We want grandkids. And so, yeah, I think that there are certain behaviors that are normalized in our culture. As a person who's been with their partner for 7 years, people who aren't in our circle start to ask those questions. People who are in my circle and know the answer don't poke that. But it's normalized to ask, oh, so you guys have been together for so long, when are you having kids? And so whenever things do cross the line into an abusive partner doing things to maintain power and control, I think it becomes harder for folks to identify that those behaviors aren't okay. So thank you both for mentioning that in the chat. I think that with all of these behaviors, it's really important because a lot of the literature focuses on cisgender females and experiencing coercion from cisgender males. I think that it's important to note that these behaviors can impact people in an assortment of relationships and with all different gender identities, because birth control sabotage for a trans person might look like interfering with your partner's access to hormones or forcing them to use hormones that they don't actually want to use. So it's important to note that when we're thinking about creating screening processes to identify survivors, that we're not making assumptions about a person's susceptibility to these behaviors based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. Yes, Teresa and Christy talking about, as a person who doesn't want kids, been told you'll change your mind by family, or it's different when the kids are yours. Those kinds of things that, again, can normalize this attitude that pregnancy is something that's on the horizon. It just needs to happen to you, and maybe then you'll decide that this is the right choice. So in the literature, they found some cases, pregnancy pressure, folks doing things to try to interfere with their partner's use of birth control, like making comments about a partner's weight, for example, or since you've been on the pill, you've been acting really crazy. Doing things like that undermine a person's confidence or interest in use of their preferred method of contraception. Those are all things that could be potential red flags. Can you all think of any other ways that reproductive coercion might show up, or kind of, I guess, examples of the three big categories here of birth control sabotage, pregnancy pressure, or pregnancy coercion? You can either pop it in a chat. Yeah, that's the common trope, Jennifer, putting a hole in the condom. I feel like that's the one that I've seen in media most frequently in relation to reproductive coercion. Perpetuating myths about abortion being dangerous, absolutely, as well as emergency contraception too. So when we get in further into this conversation, emergency contraception is a really important tool. If a person has experienced coercion recently, then they can access emergency contraception in order to prevent an unwanted pregnancy. But there are lots of myths about emergency contraception either being harmful or equating it with abortion. And neither of those are the case. Refusing to pay for birth control, putting financial pressure on the person taking it, absolutely. And also refusing to provide transportation to a person who needs to get to a clinic to get birth control or a pharmacy to get birth control. Withholding sex when a partner wants to get pregnant. Yes, there was a scene in Bridgerton of a female forcing a male to ejaculate inside of her. A lot of people dismiss it because it was a female doing it to a male. Yes, I watched that and was so frustrated that that was the framing, and there were, added layers related to race that were also displayed there. Pressure related to religious beliefs, threatening lineage of pregnancy isn't kept. Yeah, I think that you all are providing a lot of really great examples, and I think that thinking about all the different ways that this can show up is so important for being able to identify those red flags. So when Futures Without Violence, they did a study with the national hotline. It was around 2010, 2011. And they found that approximately 1 in 5 women who were calling into the hotline experienced pregnancy coercion, and 1 in 7 had experienced active interference with contraception. So pretty consistently, the literature is finding that this is happening, and that it's happening pretty frequently. Adolescent girls in physically abusive relationships were 3.5 times more likely to become pregnant than girls who weren't in physically abusive relationships. Women disclosing physical violence are nearly 3 times more likely to experience a sexually transmitted infection than women who don't disclose physical abuse. And then adolescent mothers who experience physical abuse within 3 months after delivery were nearly 2 times as likely to have a repeat pregnancy within 24 months. And so if you think about this data, I don't think that it's particularly surprising that if you're in an abusive relationship and you don't have power to have these conversations about contraception use, to have conversations about pregnancy freely, that you're seeing people experience these rapid repeat pregnancies or experiencing sexually transmitted infections. You might not have the ability to navigate that in a relationship. It might not be safe for you to do those things. And I've mentioned this previously about a lot of the research being performed specifically on cisgender heterosexual women, but there have been studies that have found that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folks are potentially at more risk of sexual coercion and violence than heterosexual people. And in addition to considering prevalence among people of all genders and sexual orientations, it's also important that we think about those intersections of race and gender. They found that non-Hispanic Black women and multiracial women are disproportionately impacted by reproductive coercion compared to white women. And in this particular study, it was 53% of non-Hispanic Black women and 43% of multiracial women compared to just 21% of white women who were studied. And so thinking about this issue through an intersectional lens is really important. And I hope that our connections to reproductive justice will kind of further exemplify why that might be. So before I move into that, are there any questions? You can pop them into chat. Or just know that you can pop questions into chat. I'm able to have it open, so keeping an eye on that consistently. So I suspect that many of you might be familiar with this lens, especially given some of the conversation that we've had. And I know that one person said that you do reproductive justice work. So this is going to be some information that you're already familiar with, but I think it's really important to bring into this conversation because as important as it is to grasp coercion at the individual and relationship level, I think I'd be missing a really good piece of the conversation if I didn't mention coercion and reproductive injustice at the macro level. And so reproductive coercion can and has happened at the hands of healthcare providers too. And I think that that's why it's so important that as we're partnering, as we're sharing information, that we have this knowledge, one, because it might help to just be better prepared for potential mistrust in health systems. It might also be helpful to help educate healthcare providers about these kinds of issues if they're not already familiar. But I think that keeping it in mind as you're partnering is such an important piece of this puzzle. That there have been historic reproductive public health atrocities like forced sterilization, testing contraception on people without letting them know potential side effects. Those have disproportionately been committed against Black people, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and poor folks all across the United States. We've seen cases in the past 2 decades, so this is not, a long time ago, of judges suggesting sterilization to incarcerated people to reduce their sentences. There has been aggressive promotion of long-acting reversible contraception to poor people and people of color. We're pretty consistently seeing the outright elimination of abortion in some states. And there are many barriers present in contraception access for people, especially for young people. And so I think that keeping in mind that we have survivors who are navigating coercion at the individual relationship level, and maybe even in families, but then we also have these macro impacts that further impact their ability to access the care that they want or that they might need. And whenever I think about why we need to keep a reproductive justice framework in mind, it's because I believe that all people deserve access to culturally and gender affirming reproductive care, comprehensive sexual and reproductive care. So I'm going to play this video from Loretta Ross of SisterSong. So she is one of the women who is involved with coining the term reproductive justice.
What is SisterSong? Many of you have probably not heard of SisterSong. We're a national coalition of more than 80 women of color and allied organizations founded in 1997. And I think that we grew largely because we offered a radical progressive analysis that turned out to be really attractive to people. We first of all believe that as women of color, we have the right to have children, but we also joined the larger pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have children. But we also recognize, and this is our third core reproductive justice principle, and that is we also, as women of color, have to fight for the right to parent the children that we have, because our right to parent our children is constantly interfered with. Here is its formal definition. Reproductive oppression is the control and exploitation of women, girls, and individuals, and through our bodies, our sexuality, our labor, and our reproduction. What we find is that through reproductive oppression, you can control entire communities. Because if you control the ability of a community to have kids, to raise their kids, to parent their kids, you can control that whole community's destiny. So to counter reproductive oppression, we at SisterSong have coined our own phrase, our own vision for reproductive justice. We believe that reproductive justice will be achieved when women amass the power, and that's power that is economic, social, and political, to make healthy decisions about our own bodies, our own labor, our own sexuality, and our reproduction for ourselves.
So reproductive justice is an intersectional framework that understands reproductive health in this full and holistic way. You heard Loretta Ross say it there. It's just as much about being able to parent the children you have without fear of police brutality, in safe and healthy neighborhoods that are not being exposed to environmental toxins, as it is about safe and legal access to abortion care. So from the Action Alliance's perspective, we really are trying to encourage folks to bring this reproductive justice framework into these conversations about coercion, because it creates space to talk about coercion and reproductive health beyond a limited understanding of choice, and shift towards a conversation about access and how larger structural and cultural systems limit or impact the way that marginalized people and communities have choices or might not have choices, and how those choices are being made. And I think that in that video, what always resonates, and I've seen it probably 50 times now, is that when she says that through reproductive oppression, you can control entire communities, I think that that is what taps into the core of why reproductive coercion is such an effective tactic of maintaining power and control over a partner. Because whenever you are impacting their ability to have or to not have children, that can change a person's entire trajectory. Having children is quite expensive. And, and for many people, you're now connected to an abuser for the rest of your life through that child. So I think that, or through children. And I think that is something that abusers are well aware of. I see that Lauren put in the chat, in the Siles, The Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck by Adam Cohen is a great book that looks at eugenics in America and its legacy. I have not read that, but I'm going to write it down so I can check that out. Thank you for sharing it. And I think something that is getting a lot of attention right now in relation to the need for a reproductive justice framework and for thinking about access to reproductive health care are these disparities that we're seeing in maternal mortality. Deaths among non-Hispanic Black women are 2.5 times the rate for non-Hispanic white women and 3.5 times the rate for Hispanic women. And so it's really important that we're considering the various systemic impacts on a person's reproductive health and wellness and how that might look different depending on their intersecting identities. And so as advocates, as healthcare providers, we all play this integral role in connecting folks to care. And there we go. Before we take a quick stretch break, this image comes from the Repeal Hide Art Project, and it illustrates, this connection between all of these different environmental justice, gender identity, building family on your own terms, all these different connections and intersections to reproductive justice. And I appreciate that such a simple image can represent or help to illustrate the complexity of our reproductive lives and the need for true reproductive and bodily autonomy. So let's do a quick little 5-minute stretch break. You can turn off your camera if you haven't. If you have it on, we can come back right at 11:05. And then we're going to talk about what do we do with everything that we just talked about. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat and then I can address them as we come back. I'm going to get a glass of water really quickly. All right, everyone, it is 11:05. When you come back, if you could put your camera back on if you feel comfy, that helps me get a sense that everyone's back in the room. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Oh, Michelle, are you doing a standing desk or just need to stretch? Ah, okay.
Just needed to move once in a while, every few hours.
Yeah, it always feels a little bit silly whenever I build those things in, but I really did need to go get some water and things. And I think it's a good reminder, we're all humans, we're allowed to take those moments. It's okay, there's always time to do more work. So thank you all for doing that. And now I want to get us into the piece around, okay, so what can we do about this? And I want to just lift up, I have a references slide at the end of this. I highly recommend checking out this resource. It's the National Health Resource Center on Domestic Violence. This is a PDF toolkit, and it outlines these different steps, and it gives more information about what that might look like. There's also IPV. Oh no, I can't remember. I'll show you the website whenever we get to that. IPV Health Partners, I believe. But essentially, Futures Without Violence has been working on this for a decade, and they have really great, very clear recommendations. So I'm going to give you basically the SparkNotes version of that. And if this is something that you are interested in, the Action Alliance can support more ongoing working with you as you're doing all the steps technical assistance. But I really do think that diving into all of this will be really important if you are going to engage in building some partnerships with local health centers or local sexual and domestic violence programs, which is the first step. And so I think that foundationally, given the prevalence of violence and coercion, we know that whether you're an advocate, whether you're a healthcare provider, no matter what system you're interacting with, we will interact with patients and clients who have experienced violence. And so in healthcare, in domestic violence programs, all clients, all patients can benefit from keeping that in mind and approaching things from a trauma-informed, from a universal education approach. So to ensure consistent trauma-informed responses to survivors, having relationships between health centers and local sexual and domestic violence programs is critical. So for example, you leave this training, you're fired up about it, you start screening for coercion today. If you don't have a relationship with a local health center, what happens when a survivor says, yes, I am experiencing reproductive coercion? So foundationally, having those partnerships as a starting step is really important to make sure that you know about each other's services, to know that you have opportunities for reciprocal support, to clarify any shared goals for the partnership. What do you want to build together? Having those relationships is going to help to facilitate warm referrals because we know that if a person does screen positive when you are working with a patient, for example, then you can ask, hey, would you like to connect with Safe Harbor? This is a local program. They're able to provide XYZ services. If you'd like to do that, we can call right now. And then the survivor could have that conversation there versus we know that if a referral is made, that sometimes I'm just thinking about myself and the times I've had medical referrals, for example, if the moment is not right, it might take me a really long time to follow up and do that thing because I just might not have capacity for it. And we know that survivors, that can happen for them too. We also know that it might not be safe for them to try to reach out to a program at home, which is especially hard during COVID. So in the past, we've seen agencies who have formed these partnerships. There is an agency in Charlottesville that actually at one point had a relationship with a nurse who would come from their local Planned Parenthood and would provide STI screening, contraception counseling. I can't remember exactly how frequently that would happen, if it was like monthly, but it was a really good opportunity for them to have this relationship, and that person would come and offer those services on site. when you are building these partnerships and you're clarifying what it is that you want to build together, I think that this is where it's really important to formalize the partnership and have a memorandum of understanding, an MOU and MOA. And that's because something that I see pretty often at the state level is that I might have a relationship with Michelle, but if Michelle moves on from her organization, then that means that maybe that partnership is not as stable whenever between me or between the Action Alliance and Michelle's organization. And so it's really important to formalize partnerships so that if there is any turnover or transition, that it's really clear what what all partners' roles are. And it's also helpful because if one of the partners is not meeting expectations, then you can revisit that and say, hey, we both agreed to doing blank. I'm noticing that that's not happening. It seems like maybe we should rethink this collaboration. Oh, thank you. Yes, memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, or MOA or MOU. So you've built your partnership. You should also prepare your organization by implementing a process to identify and respond to survivors. So when I'm talking about screening survivors, this is that part that you would, that would be that process to identify and respond. So if you're in a sexual and domestic violence agency, you should be screening for coercion in your first contact with the survivor. And if you're wondering, that feels like it might be invasive or personal. The reason for encouraging that is because if a person has experienced coercion and they do need access to emergency contraception, it's critical that you're connecting them because it is something that a person needs to have. There are a limited number of days. And so it's something that needs to happen quickly to ensure maximum effectiveness. Yeah, we need to screen with perpetrators too, Jennifer says. And so along the same lines, making access to emergency contraception, to condoms, to pregnancy tests in your shelter, that can be a really great way to start facilitating these conversations related to reproductive health. If you are in a health center, are you screening each patient for intimate partner violence? And if you are, what does that look like? How are you responding if a patient says yes? I can share my own personal experience with this. I used to go to a pretty popular reproductive health care clinic, and the healthcare assistant asked the screening questions, and along with a few other questions. And the question was framed as if I had ever experienced a particular form of violence. And the poor healthcare assistant was not prepared for the answer. And the interaction ended up with me like reassuring her, which, you know, in my case, I feel okay with doing given the work that I'm doing here, but that's not going to be the experience that every single survivor wants to have. And so I think that a few pieces of that process felt really wrong to me. First, it was kind of nestled in between here's your blood pressure check and why are you here today? There was no preamble. It was just, have you ever experienced this violence? And then it was clear that the person wasn't prepared for an affirmative response or didn't actually want to get an affirmative response, the shortness of the way that it was asked. And I think just a simple preamble could have really helped to give some context for why that question was being asked. Something like, we ask this to all of our patients because we know that intimate partner violence has lasting impacts on your health. Something so simple could have given a little bit more context for why you were asking this question, and then would have made it, I think, probably feel a little bit more comfortable for the healthcare assistant too, because then whenever there was an affirmative response, but there weren't affirmative responses to, are you in present danger? I think that she would have felt more comfy with, okay, what do I do now? So I think that keeping in mind what that process looks like, what it might feel like for survivors, consistently survivors say that they want healthcare providers to respond in non-judgmental ways. I'll show you an image and I think 2 slides that have some more information about that. This is also where it becomes Oh, I see. Teresa said that's also very important, especially if the care provider is not going to be able to provide service or support for this disclosed need. Absolutely. This is where sometimes when folks get really fired up about wanting to implement screening, we're like, okay, let's slow down, because if people aren't prepared to respond, then it actually might cause harm, or it might put off survivors from having those conversations in the future. And so there are ways that you can strategically implement this. And that's why having it be an organization-wide process is so important. This leads us directly into this third point on the slide, that training all staff on the impact of violence and coercion on health outcomes and how to assess and respond in collaboration. Because I think that something that is really, really important that I want you to hear from me is I do not expect advocates to be to know everything about contraception or about reproductive health. And I don't expect healthcare providers to know everything about safety planning, but I do expect you to know that this is the person in my community, this is the organization in my community, here's what they offer, and here's how we can get people what they need on whatever end that might be, whether you're at the health center or you are at a domestic violence shelter. Because I think that sometimes folks hear this information and are like, oh my gosh, and especially healthcare providers, you have a 15-minute appointment, folks are like, so you're asking me to introduce this whole new thing that I don't have time to do in my practices. So really emphasizing that you don't have to be an expert. You do just need to provide a little bit of education and empowerment, and then you connect to the right person, the people who have the expertise. For advocates, it's really important to think about reproductive health in the context of safety planning. If a person is in an abusive relationship and they're experiencing reproductive coercion, there are forms of contraception called long-acting reversible contraceptives, or LARCs, and those can prevent unwanted pregnancies, and they're more easily hidden from an abusive partner than something like using a condom, a patch, a ring, or a pill that can be that are more visible or easily removed, for lack of a better word, or interfered with. So the LARCs that we have recommended as more easily hidden forms of contraception are IUDs, intrauterine devices. Christy, LARCs are long-acting reversible contraceptives. Thanks for acronym check. But intrauterine devices, IUDs, so those are options. There are hormonal and non-hormonal options, and those can last between 3 and 10 to 12 years. I think that the copper IUD, Paragard, they're now saying up to 12 years. So if you're thinking from a perspective of someone needing to have something that's going to be long lasting in this relationship, those can be really great options. Implants like Nexplanon, so those go in your arm, or the shot Depo-Provera, those are considered LARCs that a person might want to use. And so again, I don't think that you need to know the ins and outs or be able to say that this one is the most effective, but knowing that those can be tools in a person's safety planning toolbox are really important, because then you can connect to healthcare providers who can have conversations with survivors about what is the actual best option. Maybe a person says, well, I don't feel really comfy with an IUD, or I want something that's non-hormonal. What option would be best? And then last and not least on this slide, we have evaluation. So this is an important part of everything that we do. How can we assess our progress if we aren't assessing our work? And it's going to look different for health centers than it is for sexual and domestic violence agencies. I'm obviously more familiar with the sexual and domestic violence agency side of things, so I can give a really concrete example there. In our data collection system, VOD data, there are 3 questions related to coercion in the risk assessment section. And so if I were a program director, one of the things that I might do to check in related to evaluation is periodically run my numbers and look and see, are people responding yes or no? Or is this NA, as though the question hasn't been responded to in VOD data? And this is actually something I do on the statewide level occasionally, just to check in and see which agencies seem to be screening, or at least capturing that they're screening, because some folks are screening and they're just not putting it in the form. I do know that too. But it at least gives a sense of whether or not those questions are being asked. And it gives a sense of when they're being asked, what percentage of time are survivors saying yes, what percentage of time are survivors saying no. So having some kind of system to evaluate, to sustain progress, to check in with your partner and figure out, is this relationship working? Are there ways to recalibrate, to do things differently? Or if it is working really well, how can you build on that and make it even stronger? So this image is actually a link on the slide, and it is a handout from Futures, and it's building sustainable and fruitful partnerships between community health centers and domestic violence programs. And it shows this reciprocal process of warm referrals between community health center partners and DV advocacy partners. And there is a quote from a community health action department director in DC that says, "We developed a system where women who have been facing violence can come to our health center and we help them to navigate the system. We have a primary partner for DV referral and support, DC Safe, a crisis center in DC. The health center doesn't provide any DV crisis intervention, but we navigate them to DV Safe. And also when DC Safe, and also when DC Safe deals with a client that needs healthcare or long-term support, they also navigate back to us. Clients that need long-term support because they're dealing with some legal issues like immigration or immigration status adjustment, we can also help these women so they're not standing alone." So again, this is from a person who's actually gone through one of these processes, and they're reiterating what I really hope that you hear here, and that's that this is intended to be a reciprocal relationship, and that you're both operating in your spheres of expertise. And this is the sheet that I wanted to reference specifically for healthcare providers. If you click on this, it will also take you to the handout link. And so this is CUES. It's an evidence-based intervention to address domestic and sexual violence in health settings. And so it has some actual examples of what you might say to introduce each component of this process. But survivors specifically say that they want health providers to be non-judgmental, listen, to offer information and support, and to not push for disclosure. So with this intervention, the goal is actually not to get survivors to disclose. So if I could have told my healthcare assistant in that screening process, the goal is not actually to get a disclosure from me, it's to provide information to me. Maybe she would have felt more comfortable with that process too. But first and foremost, we want confidential. And so it's really important that we're screening survivors, we're screening patients and clients in spaces that they are by themselves. So having one part of every health visit that they're alone is really important. This is also where knowing any kind of mandatory reporting requirements and being transparent about those is so important, because especially a lot of the work that I do is in relation to young people, and making sure that people know that a thing is going to be reported, being really transparent. It often doesn't change whether or not they're going to tell you, it just changes whether or not they felt like they had control in that process. Did they know that this is something that was going to kind of start a train that was moving? And I think that people feel really violated when they didn't know. So U&E, or universal education and empowerment. And so they recommend giving 2 safety cards. I'm going to show you the safety cards on the next slide. And you open the card and you just share what it is that you're giving them. And they frame it as, I give you 2 cards, one for a family member or friend and one for yourself. So when you see these cards, they're very small, they're folded, they're about this size, if you can see me. And they were designed and developed this way to be easily hidden in a sock, a bra, a purse, a small pocket, anything like that, so that if for some reason a person didn't feel safe bringing that material home, that they would have an easier way to hide it. So we have noted that it can be a barrier because the font is very small. So that is something that I think that they have not figured out a way to mitigate that just yet. I haven't seen like a large text version that maybe is folded into more pieces or something like that. But essentially, when you give the card, you're framing it. I give them to all of my patients. They talk about relationships and how they affect our health. And then there are some questions that you can go through. And then the last piece of the cues intervention is support. And if a person does happen to disclose, this is where you'll want to know how to support someone who discloses. And so in the little text box, they say, "Thank you for sharing this with me. I'm so sorry this is happening. What you're telling me makes me worried about your safety and health." Or a lot of my patients experience things like this. There are some resources that can help. And then this is where you can make those warm referrals. I would be happy to connect you today if that interests you. And so getting people connected to experts, that's where this comes in. So I hope that this feels like a helpful tool and that it feels a little bit more realistic, kind of seeing how it's framed, because it's not a lengthy conversation, it's pretty brief, but there's just a little bit of information. You let people know that you're giving that to every single person. I also recommend for advocates, whenever you're screening in shelters, that you're doing the same thing. Because, and I do think that you should have these conversations with every single person because it is a universal education strategy, but it also ensures that we're not making assumptions about risk factors, because, you know, in the past I've heard, well, we don't ask every person, but if I see that a person has like 3 kids under 5 or something like that, those might be the reasons that they would ask questions about reproductive coercion. And so I think it just ensures that no one's falling through the cracks whenever you're addressing this with every single patient or client. So this is the safety card. There's one on the left side of the screen and one on the right side. I've tried to include a link to download cards below, but the Futures Without Violence store has changed it a little bit, so you'll have to do some clicking around. Unfortunately, there are a ton of safety cards, which is really incredible because they have different safety cards that are either population specific, so they have some that are hanging out or hooking up. Those are the ones that are for teens. They have some that are for campus health centers. They also have an LGBTQ safety card. They also have some for Native and Indigenous women. So there are an assortment of population and culturally specific cards that they've created. So you have to kind of click around to get to them. I wish that it was a little bit more of a direct process and that I could have included that, but it appears that they've changed their store a tad bit because the links that I had before weren't working. Let me see. So yes, you can see that the size of the card is just the front face. It gets folded into lots of pieces. The Action Alliance is working with Futures Without Violence to get some of these localized for the state of Virginia, because you can see that right now the numbers on these cards go to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so we want some that go specifically to Virginia. If you are a person from out of state by any chance, you can actually request local versions for your state as well. So for Virginia folks, we're hoping to get those soon. I'm not sure what the time process is going to be like. In the past, the Department of Health did this in-house and they would send you as many as you wanted, but that stopped with COVID. So because they didn't want to be touching print materials. So we're working that out and we'll be sending lots and lots of information to folks on our listservs in Virginia whenever we have those. So are there any questions about this piece or any questions about the safety cards? Thank you, Abby. Maybe you had better luck finding a direct link that gets you to the safety cards. And thank you for the link to the guide. what I really recommend is just kind of poking around Futures Without Violence materials. They've been doing this work. They've done a ton of collecting evidence for the interventions that they're promoting. And there's a lot of really good work happening nationally because of what they're doing. So as we begin to close, I think we have a reasonable group in this. So I don't think that we need to do breakout rooms. It's not every day that you have a mix of professionals in one space. And I would love for us to kind of talk about, what does bridging the gap look like for your agency? What are you already doing? Because some of this assumes that you don't already have relationships with your health center, but it's very possible that you might, just in different capacities. So I would love for this to be an opportunity to kind of share or to brainstorm opportunities for how do you bridge that gap. Whenever I was initially conceptualizing this, I thought that it would be more folks kind of in the Northern Virginia region who might be partners, but it sounds like there's a little bit wider of a diversity, which is great, because I also think that maybe the context looks a little bit different in your areas. And that means that you can bring really great ideas or examples from what you're doing and vice versa. So I'm going to stop my share so it's a little bit easier for me to see folks. But after hearing kind of some of the best practices that have been promoted, I would love to hear, is this already happening? Does this feel realistic? Do you have any questions about it? Or are there ways that you think that we can provide some information that might support better relationships between your health center and your program?
Abby, I think you should toot your horn and talk about the great things you've done.
Thank you, Michelle. I thought being voluntold. So I work on site at Inova Fairfax Hospital with the forensic assessment and consultation team. And that's been a really good bridge into the Inova Fairfax Hospital system generally. The forensic department is one of the safety net clinics. The safety net clinics also include their HIV program, include a lot of their programs for uninsured and underinsured folks. And so that is a direct relationship that we have. We provide hospital accompaniment advocates to that department, but being on site has actually allowed me to connect directly with medical providers in that context. In terms of the sort of more community focused health, I think that we're just sort of on the cusp of some of that. With COVID, everybody is like, we don't want to hear about all these other things. We have to figure out our 17 different COVID procedures that start next week. So we're just now starting to see interest again in learning about things outside of that. And one of the things that I've started with is targeting specifically the social work and case management teams. So not every nurse and every doctor is going to have a deep understanding of sexual and domestic violence, but by working with the social work case managers and saying, like, here's your deeper understanding of safety planning, here's who to refer to, and then sort of getting the message across of, like, if you go to your case manager or if you go to your social worker, they will have more information that can be shared, has sort of been the beginning of our model for reaching out, at least within the hospital system. I can't make any claims about the health department and the county specifics.
Thank you for sharing that, Abby. I'm so excited to hear what you're doing. I think I might, as we continue on this Project Connect Revival, I'll have to reach out to you about the health system specifically. I also really appreciate you specifically uplifting the challenges related to partnership right now because of COVID. This entire partnership on the Action Alliance side of things was intended to be a relationship to get folks to work with their Title X clinics. And one of the hard realities was Title X clinics were like, we can't do this right now. And we understand it's important. We really do value this and we hear that. And we just literally cannot add something else right now. It's very hard. And so we had to take a step back and think about, okay, so what can we do from the sexual and domestic violence side of things so that we can build some capacity so that when advocates are going to their healthcare providers, they have a better sense of what opportunities might be available to them. So I think that this time is a really interesting time, and there are a lot of unknowns, and that also is going to impact what relationship building looks like if you didn't already have that before.
And I'll also mention that domestic violence seems to be an easier sell than sexual violence because
Always.
folks are like, yeah, that's always the case. But I think what I'm hearing, what I'm specifically hearing from the healthcare providers I'm working with is like, they're very afraid to send a patient home to a violent environment where there is a risk for something like homicide. And I think there's needs to be an additional layer of education about the prevalence of sexual violence and what sexual violence looks like outside of intimate partner relationships. And so we've kind of been using that intentionally and saying, yeah, we're happy to come and talk to you about domestic violence. And it was so great to work with you. We would love to come back and talk about sexual violence in a deeper sense outside of the context of intimate partner violence, in addition to, same with human trafficking. We're starting to get some human trafficking requests. I'm like, cool, we're happy to talk about human trafficking. And also, would you like to talk to us about these things? So sort of getting an idea of what the interest is, and then using that as an opportunity to build that relationship, to share out with some of the other topics that we cover.
Absolutely, that's a really wonderful strategy. And yes, it's somehow much more challenging to get buy-in related to sexual violence sometimes. And so I think that that's another really good strategy to build a relationship and have some trust so that they know and understand what you have and can offer, and then and can connect deeper about something that they might be a little bit more uncomfortable with. What about other folks? What are you already doing, or what opportunities do you see? Farewell to the folks who have other meetings. Unfortunately, I know that life. Exploring that on our hotline would be a good opportunity. We don't really ask about that right now. Yeah, I think that that's a really good opportunity. And in VA data, if you have the pleasure of filling out advocacy and or hotline forms, there are places to record responses to questions about coercion. And there are places to capture that you connected folks with sexual and reproductive health resources or providers. Because we did want to find a place for folks to be able to capture those needs.
We also have an older project with the health department. And so we started with the visiting nurses who work in the maternal and child health. And so I think that helped to sort of pick a target group where we knew it would be an issue and not have to feel overwhelmed by we're dealing with the entire health department right now in one jump. And so that enabled us to test it out and have a conversation with those nurses about how this is working. And we were able to fine tune it then. And we're ready to do more with it when COVID hit. So anyway, hopefully that will be expanded.
Yeah, that's very exciting too. And I think your suggestion of starting in a more focused way can help it to not feel so overwhelming. That is also a really okay strategy. By no means do I suggest coming in radically changing everything. And actually, when it comes to screening questions, I know that some agencies, they have found lots of different questions that they really like that drill into things. And my biggest suggestion with advocates is use what you will use. If it's going to be two really concise questions that get at what you need, and then there are opportunities for a person to expand on that, then that's wonderful. having the most beautiful 15-question assessment about this one particular area, if no one ever uses it, then it doesn't really help. And so I think being very realistic about what folks in your program have capacity for is important. I do want to share my screen one more time so that I can show you. There are a few other resources that I want to highlight. So if you're in the prevention side of things, you probably have already seen this, but Teach Consent, there is an Ask, Listen, Respect Parent and Facilitator Discussion Guide. It's intended to be a one session. There's a video that you use, and then you facilitate some discussion and conversation around consent. We also have developed this reproductive and sexual coercion toolkit. I will be mailing hard copies to every single sexual and domestic violence agency in Virginia when we officially announce the full training being available to people. So that will be coming in the mail. But in the meantime, if you want a virtual resource, then you can click on the link in the slideshow. Futures Without Violence, the IPV Health Partners, highly recommend that if you want to dive more into this. Plan First is Virginia's free family planning program, and so you can go and check that out and know that that's a resource in your back pocket. If you'd like to learn more about contraceptive coercion, access, and sex ed in the context of the United States, I really recommend reviewing that. It's some of what I use to research and support the lead-in to the reproductive justice video. The Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs and their Domestic Violence Coalition were also key partners in developing some of these best practices over the years with Futures, and they have a pregnantsurvivors.org resource, and things are split up into advocacy, healthcare providers. I believe there's a section for law enforcement as well. There are a range of topics that you can dive into. I think that their work on this has been really incredible. And then it seems like there might not be any questions, so we might be ending a few minutes early. I hope that that's okay. I'm happy to stick around if a person does have questions that they don't want to have a discussion with every single person. Oh, did I hear someone? No, I thought somebody was coming off mute and I just couldn't see you. So please.
I was wondering for someone who doesn't really have financial means to just needing to get help because they've been in some of the material that has been covered today. Where could they go? Like where could they find on a national level? Like is there like a one source website where like they could filter for you depending on what state you're searching for, where you could go to try to get help?
So you're asking if a person wanted to get help related to sexual or reproductive coercion, is there a place that we could send people nationally to get connected to resources?
Yes, a national number or like a national website to find places within their state.
There is the national hotline. I do think that often state-based resources tend to be a little bit better in getting folks connected to resources in their communities. Abby, I bet you're probably already looking this up because I know a little bit about you. Are you looking that up? A number?
Yeah. I was looking locally. I don't know about a national or state other than obviously our wonderful Action Alliance, but I do know that we have local, we don't have a Planned Parenthood in Fairfax County, but we do have a local reproductive healthcare clinic. I'm not gonna promise that they're super well trained on coercion yet. That's sort of something that we are hoping to do in the future. But we do have that if that's something that would be helpful to folks.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes,
Oh, sorry.
I would like that information very much.
Thank you. We can definitely make sure that we get that to you. And I see there has been a chat. Thank you, Falls Church Healthcare Center. Yeah, so it definitely depends on where the person might be located. I recommend, if possible, getting folks connected to things more in community. I don't work in direct advocacy. In my experience, I have heard that when folks get routed from the national hotlines to state, then to local, it can sometimes be a process that is not always ideal for survivors or callers to those hotlines. So those resources are there and they're very helpful. And often people who are in the communities where the survivor is located know more about those communities, are going to be able to get you directed more to what you need. So we can make sure that we get that to you. And this is my contact information. We have a culture change team at the Action Alliance. We do a lot of prevention work, but we also do things that are related to social change and anti-oppression. If you're not sure what it is that you might need, you can just email prevention@bsdballiance.org and you'll get one of us, and we're always happy to direct you to the right place. And then last but not least, these are the references. It's a little bit tight on that slide, tighter than I realized. So you should have links, or at least places to go and connect with anything that I referenced in the slideshow. I really do appreciate all of you for joining, and we want to make sure that you know that the Action Alliance is here as a resource. If you're connected to Fairfax, they are also a wonderful resource on this topic and can provide a lot more information. So thank you all for joining, and I'm happy to stick around to see if anyone might have any more questions.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And for those that are still around, if we are going to send a survey. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute or two to complete the survey, the slides and the recording will be sent to you probably sometime next week. So you'll have the information that Kristen went over, as well as the references by next week. But thank you all for joining us. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation. And also, we still have our next month's presentation, which is going to be on August 4th, Wednesday, August 4th. And the topic is incarcerated victims of sexual violence. So in my follow-up email, I will also send a link on how you can register for that training. Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
There was a question in the chat about certificate of attendance.
Yes, I will answer them directly if they're still. They have left, so. Oh, no, they haven't.
Can you answer it for everybody?
I'm sorry?
Could you answer that question for everyone?
So, yes, we can provide, but you would have to email me directly. We don't have the certificates available at the moment. They are being created, so probably by the end of the month, but I would need you to email me and let me know that you are interested in getting one.
And I shared the link for the national hotline, National Domestic Violence Hotline, where they have a call, a chat, and a text option. And that can be a good national starting place.
Yes, I did receive it, and I believe that I answered it. You are on the list already. Thank you.